Thank you. It's a real honor to be invited to speak in front of you all today, and I can't let this moment pass without extending my own personal congratulations and thanks to John Byrne. It was an honor to be introduced by John, and I'm quite honored to be able to share the stage with John. And I certainly don't go back with John the way someone like Rick Small does, but John has been a colleague of mine for many, many years, and always somebody that I admired and respected, and really one of the good guys in our profession. So congratulations for everything you've accomplished, John, and good luck in the future, and I look forward to continuing to get to work with you. As I was saying, it's really nice to be here. There's so many new faces that I see, and there's so many old friends that have been here for a long time and who I've had the pleasure of working with for a long time. So I'm just going to jump right into my remarks and hopefully leave a little bit of time for questions. What I thought I'd talk a little bit about today is talk a little bit about how we got to where we are today in the field of illicit finance, a little survey at least of my impressions of the history and development of the field of illicit finance, really to set up what I want to set out as the key issues that I think we're all going to be facing now and in the years to come, because I think this is a really exciting moment in the field of illicit finance, and I think the fact that there's so many people here really underscore how important and how vital a moment this is for all of us in this field. Really, when you think about the story of the evolution of illicit finance, it's up until the present time, up until now, it's been a story of expansion. It's been a story of evolution and expansion in both scope and depth. But as I said, this is an interesting moment because today we're living with the consequences of that expansion. We're living with those consequences, for better and for worse. But I do think that narrative is starting to give way. That's not to say that I think there's going to be a contraction in the future. I think there most certainly will not be a contraction. But the challenges that we're going to be facing as illicit finance or anti-illicit finance professionals are going to become more difficult, they're going to become more complex, they're going to become more confusing. But they're also going to be fascinating, and they're going to be important, and they're going to really put us right on the cutting edge of the latest in technological innovation, in geopolitics, and in international finance. So it's quite a moment for all of us. So let me do sort of my survey, and then I'll get to where I think we're going to go. And whenever I talk about the field of illicit finance, what I always like to emphasize is really how new, how young this field is. John and I were just chatting about that right before we took the stage, as to how much things have really developed just in a very few years. When you think about it, the first country to criminalize money laundering was the United States, and that wasn't until 1986. Money laundering wasn't a crime anywhere in the world before 1986, and the U.S. was the first country to criminalize money laundering in that year. And even then, it was just with respect to the proceeds of narcotics trafficking. That obligation became globalized in 1988 with the UN Vienna Convention, still limited to narcotics trafficking. And then in 1990, you had the creation of the Financial Action Task Force by the G7, with the goal of trying to flesh out what sort of obligations these weird new anti-money laundering laws was going to require of countries, and what sort of obligations those countries were going to need to place on banks in order to really implement and make these new anti-money laundering laws and these new anti-money laundering efforts meaningful. And so that leads into the 90s, and you have, again, the narrative of expansion. You have the expansion in terms of countries covered. So FATF was started by the G7. By the time you get to the mid-90s, it has 26 members. Virtually every major financial center becomes a member of the FATF. So you have expansion in terms of countries that are committed to implementing anti-money laundering laws. You have expansion in terms of scope of the anti-money laundering offense, moving from just narcotics trafficking to the proceeds of all major crimes. You have expansion in terms of coverage, going from banks to non-bank financial institutions to DNFBPs, designated non-financial businesses and professions. And then you have expansions in terms of the expectation of the complexity and the precision and the specificity of the regulations and obligations that stem from all of this. constant expansion. Yeah, I thought when Rick was introducing John and he sort of rolled through some of the things that John was involved in, it just reinforced the point in my mind as I was thinking about it in terms of the development of the SARS and the development of the forms. It all sort of starts off as a philosophical idea, and then you just have this constant expansion from that idea, and that takes you through the 1990s. But by the time we get to the late 90s, we started to see some of the limits of that expansion. What FATF was very effective in doing was ensuring that all of its members, and at that point again, I think there were about 26 members, it was very effective in ensuring that its members had sort of similar sets of laws and regulations on the books. But there were really two sort of walls that FATF and the international community, the international financial community, was sort of running up against at that point. The first one was, what about everybody else? What about the countries that aren't FATF members? That was the first sort of big question. And the second one, is anyone actually really doing this stuff? This stuff is getting put on the books, but what are the actual implications of this in the real world? So I'm going to get to that second question in a few minutes, but I'll start with that first question of how do you really make this a global system, not just a system of the major financial centers? Because certainly as the communications revolution developed, as the technology revolution developed, it wasn't going to be good enough if it was even just the major financial centers. There were too many points of access into the international financial system. So what it started off is FATF in the mid to late 90s just started asserting that the FATF standards were the international standard, were the sole international standard that all countries in the world were obligated to implement. But who said? It was just FATF sort of asserting that. There was no treaty, there was no endorsement by any recognized international body. FATF itself wasn't a recognized international body. Even to this day, FATF is an informal task force. It's not a body that has any sort of corporate entity to it, corporate legal actuality to it. The IMF and the World Bank were expressly non-supportive of the effort. They would not get behind it. They were approached several times throughout the 90s and rejected all efforts to bring them on board the fight against money laundering. They regarded it as an entirely law enforcement effort. And in fact, they were quite active in trying to set up offshore financial centers, particularly in the Caribbean and throughout the world, that had very little focus on anti-money laundering issues. You had no focus anywhere else. You had no focus at the UN. You had no focus in other international bodies. FATF attempted to address the issue by establishing FATF-style regional bodies throughout the world. Those bodies have developed quite nicely by now, but certainly at the time, most of those bodies, to the extent that they existed, really existed just to defend the status quo of their particular regions, were not forces for change, were not forces for actual implementation of international standards. What I think really was the first major change in the global expansion, sort of the next sort of real breakthrough, was Larry Summers, when Larry Summers became Secretary of the Treasury in the late 90s. Secretary Summers used to talk about building an international financial architecture, a new international financial architecture in the wake of the end of the Cold War. We were going to build a new international financial architecture, and he used to talk about pillars to that architecture. And one of those pillars was anti-money laundering. It seems so obvious now, and it seems so not particularly interesting to think that would be the case, but it was quite revolutionary at the time. That he would talk about, when you had the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States talking about building the international financial architecture, and a pillar of that architecture was going to be protecting the integrity of the international financial system through the enforcement of anti-money laundering laws. It was revolutionary. It really is the basis, in a lot of ways, the basis of what brings everybody in this room together. It was the notion that there's a role for counter-illicit finance in the international financial system separate and apart from simply law enforcement. Law enforcement is extremely important, but all of a sudden you had finance ministries getting involved and talking about it from a systemic level and making it really part of what we were trying to build throughout the world. So what Secretary Summers really inspired was two developments, one domestically within the United States and then one internationally. Within the United States, he began a process which a lot of people here were involved with. I wonder what they thought of the process, but it was a process to develop the first national money laundering strategy within the United States. And again, what that did was it demonstrated that the United States was going to start taking a holistic approach, a systemic approach to the fight against money laundering, not simply as a sort of a path to get to asset forfeiture for law enforcement investigations, but as a real systemic effort. And that was domestically within the United States. And then globally, it was basically through his pressure that the FATF launched the NCCT process, the Non-Cooperative Countries and Territories process, which really just backed by the raw economic might of the G7, really just required the rest of the world to get on board with the FATF standards. And from that point on, you never had any question that these were going to be the global standards, because the G7 was just going to insist on it. Of course, the next then big development was the tragedy of 9/11. In our area, that led to, I think, three important developments. One, obviously, was the Patriot Act. Again, the next big expansion of at least the U.S. domestic anti-money laundering framework. It also led to the integration of sanctions into what I would call the field of illicit finance. Obviously, sanctions had been with us before 9/11, but they had never been integrated in a real way to U.S. foreign policy or national security efforts. For the first time, and for a variety of reasons that I don't have time, unfortunately, to really get into, for the first time after 9/11, you had targeted financial sanctions, in this case against terrorist organizations and their supporters, being deployed at the hands of a finance ministry, at the hands of the U.S. Treasury Department, to advance U.S. national security interests. That was a major, major development and a major, again, expansion of the field of illicit finance. And then finally, you had the creation of the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence within the Treasury Department. Again, for the first time now, you have an office within, in this case, the U.S. Treasury Department, whose entire purpose was to the strategic development of all of the tools that that the United States had at its disposal in the field of illicit finance, sanctions, anti-money laundering, the tools that the Patriot Act gave us, all of our relationships with the Financial Action Task Force, with the IMF, with the World Bank, with finance ministries across the world, with central banks across the world. For the first time, you had a central point within the U.S. Treasury Department that said, we are going to take all of this and develop and implement strategies to advance U.S. foreign policy and national security. Now, all of a sudden, you start to see illicit finance become central to the U.S. response to its most vital and central national security issues. Iran, North Korea, Russia, terrorism, counter-narcotics. You cannot name a major national security foreign policy issue from basically 2005 on to present that doesn't have a substantial illicit finance component to it, whether it's primarily a money laundering issue, primarily a terrorist financing issue, primarily a sanctions issue. And that was a major, major development that came out of that time around 9/11. Of course, around that same time, then the IMF and the World Bank start to get on board. The standards really do get incorporated into the international financial system. And we have what we had been looking for a long time, which was a global system, which gets us to then that second question. Is anybody actually really doing it? Which is the $64,000 question. If you look over the past 10 years, I think the answer certainly from the U.S. Justice Department, whatever we think as individuals, the answer certainly from U.S. law enforcement has been that it's not been implemented certainly enough. And you've had then the series of enforcement actions that have really grabbed everybody's attention. I think the result of those enforcement actions, and again, I could talk about this issue all day and I have such limited time, but I think the result of all of that, of all of these enforcement actions really has been twofold. I think you've seen the final expansion that I want to talk about in terms of AML-CFT, and that's the massive explosion of compliance costs in compliance departments, and the massive explosion of conferences like this is just a testament to that final development of all of these enforcement actions, which is to really raise the profile and importance and integration of compliance in the international financial system, the international financial community. And then in some ways, the other side of that coin has been the de-risking phenomena, which I think is a very complicated phenomenon that I'm sure we could have whole sessions on, and I'm sure there actually have probably been whole sessions on. But in certain ways, you could think about the de-risking phenomenon as the international financial system trying to absorb these costs and trying to absorb, for the first time, really grappling with the implications of this new framework that's actually being enforced in a significant way over the past 10 years, really for the first time. And that's led again to, I think, obviously, people focus on the negative developments associated with de-risking, but there actually have been some positive developments associated with de-risking as well. And so that gets us to where we are today. Expansion in terms of depth, in terms of scope, in terms of costs, and here we are in this big room. So I just want to look forward just for a couple of minutes and talk about what I think are some key issues moving forward. First of all, even though I don't think that we're going to see a continuing expansion of the rules and an expansion of the costs and an expansion of the scope and depth, I don't think we're going to see a contraction either. I think it's pretty clear that these rules and the system and this framework is here to stay. When I was at the Treasury Department, I was part of the transition from the Clinton administration into the Bush administration, and then the transition from the Bush administration into the Obama administration. And when the Bush administration came in, there really actually was a very serious reexamination of the anti-money laundering rules and regulations. And a lot of the people that were coming in at that time were really looking at this and saying, you know, are these regulations that we really support? And there was an open question, really up until 9/11, within the Bush administration as to which way the Bush administration was going to go. Now, after 9/11, the Bush administration wound up taking it farther than any of us in our wild imagination even thought was possible in the year 2000. But there was really that question. You did not have that question when the Obama administration came in, and I do remember that transition, thinking to myself, gosh, you know, what are these guys going to think? Are they going to think of this new office within Treasury as some sort of Bush administration innovation that is not appropriate for the Obama administration? And they didn't think that at all. In fact, when they asked my old boss, Stuart Levy, to stay, Stuart was a political appointee in the Bush administration. When President Obama asked him to stay, I think it really sent the message, at least to me, that the Obama administration was very serious about continuing the efforts that had begun in the Bush administration. And then you look at the Trump administration, who has certainly not been shy about reversing trends within the Obama administration. You have not seen any move to reduce any aspect of the illicit finance regime. So I do think it's pretty safe to say that regardless of whether we see continued expansion, this is not going anywhere. Secondly, to pick up on my first theme, these tools and authorities are quite central to the Trump administration's foreign policy and national security efforts. Even in the first 6 months of the Trump administration, we've seen new executive orders, OFAC executive orders. We've seen them use Section 311 of the Patriot Act right off the bat. We've seen lots of designations, and Congress has gotten into the act with respect to Russia. There's not going to be any sort of shortage of new developments and new uses of the tools that the Treasury Department gives whatever administration is running the United States government at a particular time. Which then gets to my third point is, I think that's really when you look at some of the political developments that are in the newspapers these days, I think there's a real potential for a lot of confusion and a lot of really, really tough issues that might be presenting themselves for people like yourselves, people who are in the compliance business. Look at North Korea. John and I in our podcast actually talked a little bit about North Korea. North Korea is a really interesting issue, which I'd be happy to get into in greater detail. But what you're seeing right now is, I think, a recognition by the Trump administration that the United States acting alone cannot place the type of existential pressure that is required to be placed on North Korea to get North Korea to change its nuclear policy. The United States is incapable of applying that type of pressure alone against North Korea. There's only really one country that could place that pressure on North Korea, and that country is China. So the challenge for the new administration is going to be whether it can persuade China, one way or another, to apply that type of pressure. I will say personally, I'm very, very skeptical that this administration or any administration will be able to accomplish that. But this administration certainly seems like it's prepared to try. To the extent that it does try, and to the extent that that attempt at persuasion includes pressure, includes targeting Chinese banks, includes targeting Chinese entities, you can see a potential for a real sort of split in how sanctions are being enforced and how AML-CFT requirements are being enforced in two pretty big and important parts of the world, North America and Asia. And that's going to create issues, I think, for compliance officers. Likewise, you look at the latest developments with respect to Iran and the JCPOA, and questions about whether the Trump administration is going to walk away from the JCPOA, and questions that are very prominent right now with respect to decertification. If that were to happen, if the Trump administration were to walk away from the JCPOA, without me opining on my personal views on that issue, imagine the confusion that's going to cause with respect to obligations in the United States versus obligations in Europe versus obligations in the rest of the world. These are issues that people in this room, compliance professionals, are going to be thrust right into the middle of some of the touchiest, thorniest, most difficult geopolitical issues of our day. And it's going to be, and those issues are going to be fought out in bank compliance offices. It's amazing. It's amazing the world we live in. But these issues that we read about, these very sort of big issues that we read about in the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, these are issues that are going to play out in a very, very real way in compliance offices. And I don't think there's going to be easy answers. And I think it's going to be very difficult and confusing if things go in certain directions. And then even finally, countries are freelancing, so it's not just the United States anymore that's implementing our own sort of unilateral sanctions. You look at the crisis in the Gulf right now, and the new sanctions that have been imposed by Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, and Egypt with respect to Qatar, and with respect to the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, these are sanctions that banks doing business in that part of the world are going to have to account for, even though they have no basis in any UN resolution. They have no basis in any U.S. action. They have no basis in any EU action. You have all new countries sort of asserting their sort of financial, economic sovereignty in terms of imposing and using these types of tools that are going to create even more problems for compliance officers trying to figure out what their banks should be doing, what their banks are allowed to do, what their banks would be wise not to do. These are going to be really, really tough questions, and I think you're going to see that more and more. I think Russia's already demonstrated that it is not shy about imposing financial sanctions. I don't know, do you guys think China's going to be far behind, or are they going to be able to resist? So, it's going to be interesting. Two other sort of quick developments. One is, this is my fourth development, I think there is going to continue to be an increased focus on effectiveness. That is being pushed by the Financial Action Task Force right now in their new fourth round of assessments. Countries are being assessed not just for technical compliance, but in a very, very deliberate way. The FATF is looking at implementation effectiveness. What I think that means for the people in this room, though, is that countries are going to feel an increased pressure from FATF to actually take enforcement actions. I think that that's going to be the way FATF ultimately is going to try to figure out how to measure some of this stuff, because it's so very difficult to measure. And a lot of the countries that I've spoken with and a lot of the countries that I've worked with over the past several months seem to be very much focused on the need to take enforcement actions to demonstrate to the FATF that they are in fact doing something. And I think that's going to be relevant for this field and for the people who do the type of work that we do. And then finally, is the final development is technology. Again, one of the more interesting developments of our time, and I think technology is going to play two roles. One is, and maybe this is another expansion, is as we sort of puzzle through the application of illicit finance laws and regulations to new technologies like blockchain, Bitcoin, things like that. That's going to be a really, really interesting set of issues for all of us to follow and for governments to try to grapple with. And then finally, how financial institutions use technology to control the costs. As I said, the most recent expansion has been the tremendous expansion of compliance costs. But I do think technology And I think that you just need to look at some of the presentations that people are making this week on this stage and across the hall and in the booths. There's so much focus on the ability of technology to make this a more manageable set of issues for all the financial institutions and others around the world who are trying to grapple with these things. And that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch as well. So that is my presentation. I ran a little bit over. I'm sorry. Again, thank you for inviting me. It was a real honor to be here, and I'm happy to talk.
I got time just for a couple of questions, but going back to your point about this administration and your view, which is shared by many, that there probably won't be a decline in or reduction in regulations or legislation in this space. But I got a broader question. The success of AML is due in large part to the international aspect of it. So whether it's FATF or Wolfsburg or whatever it wants, it's a combination of people working together. Given this administration's negative attitude toward internationalism, whether it's thumbing their nose at the UN or NATO or the Atlantic Alliance, are you concerned at all that that could have a spillover effect to organizations like FATF and others that we really need in order to, again, test the effectiveness that we talked about? Do you think that, or is it siloed enough at Treasury and other agencies that probably there won't be any blowback?
Well, it's a great question. I think that the people who understand this stuff within the administration understand the point that you just made, that the power of the tools is precisely the fact that they have the ability to resonate globally. And the U.S. has a tremendous amount of unilateral power in that regard. I've actually always been a great defender of U.S. unilateralism in this area in a certain sense, but it is without question the case that they're never going to reach their greatest potential unless they're done in a multilateral context, whether the context be FATF or whether the context be in conjunction with the European Union. Certainly in the case of North Korea, it is absolutely impossible for us to succeed without the cooperation of China. So this administration is going to hopefully understand that and hopefully proceed in a way consistent with that. If they don't, they're simply not going to achieve their goals. It's as simple as that. There's a difference between wishing a result and achieving a result, and achieving a result is going to require our financial tools to be deployed in a multilateral way.
You've talked about, obviously, sanctions, as you mentioned, didn't used to really be part of the AML infrastructure. Clearly is now. Mm-hmm. And obviously it's been a well-known and effective, for the most part, national security tool. But you do start to see some, and not even about North Korea, you start to see articles where people are opining that seems to always be our default mechanism. Add sanctions here, add sanctions there. Just give us from a very high level what you think sanctions are for the most part designed to do, and how effective, because you helped spearhead a lot of that in your career at Treasury.
Right. I think that, look, sanctions are very attractive to policymakers because they're overt. You never underestimate the pressure that is brought to bear on U.S. officials in the context of a perceived international crisis to look like they're doing something. Right. And I don't say that as a criticism. There is such an enormous pressure to appear to be doing something in addition to, in fact, to be doing something. And so no matter what they're doing, in fact, what is so attractive to them about sanctions, it's an overt thing that they can point to, which is, I think, why people default to sanctions a lot. Now, I don't think that's always a very healthy development, and what I always said when I was in government, and what I continue to say, is that if sanctions are the policy, then there is no policy. Sanctions are a tool that need to be deployed in service of a policy. You saw that with how sanctions were deployed in service of our Iran policy. Whatever you think about the results of the negotiation, the sanctions were very, very clearly deployed with a particular goal in mind. And that's the way they need to be continued to be deployed. If all they are sort of glorified press releases to explain that we're really mad, then they'll serve that purpose, but they won't serve the overall purpose of achieving a particular policy goal.
Last question. I always like to ask this of folks that have been in government many years and now they're in the private sector. So obviously there's some tools you don't have access to. There's some policy issues you have no sway on. You can comment on, but it's not the same thing. What's been the biggest challenge for you now that you're both part of the private sector in terms of, I know you do training, you have clients and all that. What's the biggest change for you and the biggest challenge being sort of on the outside?
Yeah, I got to say, it's been great. I thought it was going to be very, very difficult. I thought it was going to be a rougher transition for me than it turned out to be. For those of you who don't know, I was at the Treasury Department for 20 years, and I held senior positions in both the Bush and Obama administrations, and I loved it so much, and I thought it was going to be very, very difficult. As it turns out, it's been a lot of fun. I've gotten to do a lot of the same things. I've gotten to be involved in the think tank world a little bit, so I sort of get to exercise that muscle. And I've been able to, what's so cool about this area, and what I was trying to sort of get across early in my remarks is we all get to continue to be involved, in some of the thorniest, but also most interesting and important issues that we as a country are facing right now. And it's been a lot of fun to get to keep doing it from a different perspective. And as I tell people, I think it was probably time for me to go. In any case, I think it was probably time for me to go and sort of refresh. And it really has been very refreshing to be out in the private sector.
Well, we really appreciate this. I would just say, we did sit down for a podcast, about a half-hour discussion a couple of weeks ago, more in depth on sanctions. So it's up on the ACAM's website if you want to learn more about Danny's view on North Korea and other issues related to that. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Danny for participating today.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you.